December 17th, 1944. The winter forest of the Ardennes lay silent under a heavy blanket of snow, the kind of silence that makes every sound echo like a hammer on steel. But that silence was broken by the coughing and sputtering of a German Tiger tank's engine. Inside the frozen metal beast, SS Colonel Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch. The Maybach engine, powerful enough to drive this 70-ton monster across Europe, had just gone silent, not from damage, not from enemy fire, but because the fuel tanks were bone dry. Peiper climbed down into the bitter cold, his breath steaming in the December air. Around him, dozens of tanks and armored vehicles stood idle, their crews pacing in frustration. Behind those steel machines waited nearly 5,000 men, hand-picked Waffen-SS soldiers, the elite of Hitler's army, all of them stuck, all of them powerless. The offensive had begun only a day earlier, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, the Ardennes offensive, what Americans would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. Its goal was audacious: drive through Belgium, capture the port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. But here, in the small Belgian village of Honsfeld, the mighty spearhead of the German 6th Panzer Army had ground to a halt. Not because of enemy resistance, but because the one resource more precious than ammunition had run out: gasoline. For the German army in 1944, fuel was the true currency of war. Without it, tanks became pillboxes, trucks became useless hulks, and entire divisions became stranded. And on that frigid morning, as Peiper stood in the snow, he realized he was staring at disaster. Yet, just beyond the village, through the mist, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The Americans had abandoned their positions in haste. Fires still smoldered in oil drums. Coffee sat steaming in tin mugs. And beyond the empty foxholes stood something that looked almost like a miracle. Row upon row of olive-drab jerry cans, stacked high like pyramids. American fuel, thousands of gallons of it. For a brief moment, Peiper felt as though the gods of war had smiled on him. Perhaps this campaign wasn't doomed after all. Perhaps the road to Antwerp still lay open. But as he walked among those mountains of American fuel, the thought crept into his mind like the cold fog seeping into his boots. If the Americans could afford to abandon such vast supplies, if they could leave behind what Germany would guard with entire divisions, what did that say about the true balance of power in this war? This was not just a battlefield discovery. It was a glimpse into the industrial heart of America. And for Joachim Peiper, that realization would cut deeper than any wound a bullet could inflict. And to understand why this moment at Honsfeld mattered so deeply, we need to know the man at the center of it, Joachim Peiper. At just 29 years old, Peiper was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the entire German military. He was handsome, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. To Hitler, he embodied the image of the perfect SS officer. To his enemies, and even to some of his own men, he was a figure both feared and despised. Peiper had risen quickly through the ranks of the Waffen-SS. He began as a personal adjutant to Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. In that role, he had seen the dark machinery of the Nazi regime up close. Later, on the Eastern Front, he commanded armored units in battles that chewed up hundreds of thousands of men. His leadership earned him the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Nazi Germany's highest awards for bravery. But Peiper's reputation wasn't built on medals alone. He was known for a cold, almost mechanical way of waging war. In Russia, his units had burned villages and executed prisoners. Even among hardened SS veterans, his brutality stood out. His men called him Jochen, but behind that almost friendly nickname lay a commander who demanded absolute obedience and showed little mercy. By late 1944, Hitler needed men like Peiper more than ever. The Reich was collapsing on all fronts, Soviets in the east, Americans and British in the west. Fuel supplies were nearly gone. The Luftwaffe had been bled dry. Yet Hitler clung to one last hope, a surprise offensive through the Ardennes, and for the critical thrust of that operation, the very tip of the spear, he chose Joachim Peiper. Why Peiper? Because he was bold, because he was young enough to still believe in miracles, and because, in Hitler's words, Peiper had the heart of a lion and the will of iron. Peiper's unit, Kampfgruppe Peiper, wasn't just another column of tanks. It was the designated Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire offensive. If Peiper broke through, the rest of the German army would follow. If he failed, the operation would collapse. The stakes could not have been higher. On December 14th, 2 days before the attack began, Peiper attended a final briefing. His orders were clear. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. He knew the numbers didn't add up. His tanks were allotted only enough fuel for 50 miles of combat. The River Meuse was 65 miles away. The math was impossible. But Peiper didn't flinch. He accepted the mission with the same grim confidence that had carried him through the frozen hell of Russia. For him, hesitation was weakness. What he didn't yet realize, what he couldn't yet admit, was that this mission wasn't just desperate, it was suicidal. And in the snowy forests of Belgium, his name would become forever linked with both battlefield ferocity and with atrocities that would haunt his legacy long after the guns fell silent. By the winter of 1944, Germany's most dangerous enemy wasn't just the Red Army or the American GI marching across France. It was the fuel gauge. From the very beginning, the Third Reich had been living on borrowed energy. Germany possessed almost no natural oil of its own. Instead, it relied on imports from Romania's Ploiești oil fields and on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline. For a while, it was enough. But as Allied bombers darkened the skies, that fragile supply chain began to collapse. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, had tried to warn the Führer. In June 1944, he presented a report that should have ended all offensive operations immediately. The numbers were devastating. In April, Germany's synthetic plants produced 175,000 tons of fuel. By September, under relentless Allied bombing, output had dropped to just 5,000 tons. That was a 97% collapse in 5 months. To put it simply, the German war machine was running on fumes. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was producing oil in amounts so vast it defied comprehension. In 1944 alone, America pumped out 1.8 billion barrels of crude. By comparison, all of Germany, counting synthetic production, captured stocks, and Romanian fields, managed only 33 million barrels. Less than 2% of American output. Think about that. 2%. While German soldiers scrounged for a few gallons to move their tanks, American forces were practically swimming in petroleum. They built entire pipeline systems, like Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, that carried hundreds of thousands of gallons per day straight to the front. And when pipelines weren't enough, they sent endless convoys of trucks, the famous Red Ball Express, roaring across France with 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. The contrast could not have been sharper. German soldiers were issued bicycles when trucks ran out of fuel. Farmers went back to plowing fields with horses. Civilians hadn't seen private cars on the streets since 1942. In some cities, people whispered about black market theft of single liters of gasoline, guarded more carefully than gold. And yet Hitler refused to face reality. He still believed that one bold strike, one dramatic blow, could change everything. The Ardennes offensive was built on that illusion. The plan required 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million, but only half of that ever made it to the front. So how was it supposed to work? Simple and insane. The entire operation depended on capturing Allied fuel dumps along the way. Germany wasn't planning to bring enough gas. They were planning to steal it. It was a strategy that revealed weakness, not strength. No great power launches a campaign hoping to rob its enemies' gas stations. But by late 1944, Germany had no other choice. And that's why Joachim Peiper's mission mattered so much. His Kampfgruppe wasn't just tasked with punching through enemy lines. They were supposed to seize American supplies at every step, like a starving army raiding a neighbor's pantry. Without those stolen gallons, the entire offensive would grind to a halt. Peiper knew it. His superiors knew it. Even Hitler must have known it, deep down. And that is why the discovery at Honsfeld, the abandoned American depot filled with 50,000 gallons of fuel, seemed like a miracle. But miracles can be deceiving. The Ardennes. A place that looked harmless on a map. A patch of forested hills in Belgium and Luxembourg. To Hitler, it seemed the perfect spot for a surprise attack. The Americans had called it a quiet sector, a place where exhausted divisions were sent to rest and recover. It was here, he believed, that the German army could break through like a dagger in the dark. But anyone who actually tried to move an armored column through the Ardennes knew the truth. It was no highway. It was a trap of narrow country lanes, steep hills, and frozen ruts that swallowed tanks whole. On December 16, 1944, Peiper's Kampfgruppe began its advance. Almost immediately, the grand plan collided with harsh reality. German maps showed broad roads, where in fact there were little more than farm tracks. Heavy Tiger and Panther tanks churned up the ground, creating bottlenecks that stretched for miles. Trucks, half-tracks, horse-drawn wagons, and bicycles all clogged the same paths. Progress slowed to a crawl. Every delay meant engines idling, and every idling engine drank precious fuel. Worse still, the Americans didn't just roll over. At the village of Lanzerath, Peiper's force encountered a tiny American reconnaissance platoon, just 18 men from the 99th Infantry Division. By every rule of war, they should have been swept aside in minutes. Instead, they fought like lions. Using rifles, machine guns, and sheer grit, they held up nearly 5,000 German soldiers for almost 10 hours. 10 hours. While those 18 men fought and died in their foxholes, Peiper's tanks sat burning fuel they couldn't afford to waste. By the time the column finally pushed through, it had already used up nearly half its supply, and the terrain only got worse. Roads twisted through forests so dense that tanks had to move in single file. When one vehicle broke down, and many did, it stopped everything behind it. Crews worked frantically in the freezing cold, pulling engines apart, towing dead machines out of the way, cursing as the clock ticked on. All the while, Peiper drove his men harder, faster, pushing them to reach the Meuse River before the Americans could react. But inside, he must have felt the dread growing. Every mile covered, every skirmish fought, every hour lost meant more fuel burned and less chance of reaching the objective. By dawn on December 17th, his column had advanced only 20 miles. That short distance had cost him 40% of his gasoline. At that pace, they would run dry long before they ever reached the Meuse, and that is when fate seemed to throw him a lifeline. The abandoned American depot at Honsfeld appeared before him, filled with row upon row of olive-drab jerry cans, more fuel than he could have dreamed of. For a moment, it seemed as though fortune had smiled on Hitler's young commander. But as Peiper walked among those mountains of gasoline, another thought pressed in. If the Americans could afford to abandon so much fuel, if they could leave behind in haste what his men treated as treasure, what did that really say about Germany's chances? For now, though, he pushed that doubt aside. His men needed fuel, and Honsfeld had delivered. The column roared back to life, engines growling, tracks biting into the snow. The advance continued, but the forest still lay ahead. The rivers, the villages, the resistance. And Peiper knew deep down that 50,000 gallons was only a drop in an ocean compared to what the Americans could bring to the battlefield. The morning of December 17th, 1944, was bitterly cold. Frost clung to the trees, and a pale sun struggled to pierce the Ardennes mist. Joachim Piper's men marched wearily into the village of Honsfeld, boots crunching on frozen ground, their tanks growling low, engines sputtering from thirst. What they found there must have felt like stepping into another world. The Americans had abandoned their forward supply depot in such haste that coffee still steamed in tin cups on makeshift tables. Half-burned fires glowed in barrels. Helmets and rifles leaned against sandbags, as if their owners had simply vanished into the fog. And then Piper saw them. Row after row of jerry cans, stacked into pyramids that stretched down the road like a bizarre parade. Olive-drab metal containers, the unmistakable shape of American fuel cans, each holding 5 gallons of gasoline. Thousands of them. Enough to turn a stranded armored column into a roaring engine of war again. Piper approached cautiously, almost reverently, as though afraid the vision might dissolve if he blinked. His adjutant cracked open a can and sniffed. High-octane American gasoline, cleaner and stronger than the fuel German engines usually drank. The men around him broke into cheers, some laughing, others shouting with relief. For soldiers who had just spent the night wondering if their tanks would ever move again, this seemed like salvation. 50,000 gallons. That was the estimate as they began counting, hauling, pouring the liquid treasure into waiting tanks. To a German commander, that number was staggering. Entire panzer divisions had been allotted less fuel in the past 6 months. Here, in a single village, the Americans had left behind more than most German armies could dream of. Piper must have felt a surge of triumph. His Kampfgruppe could keep moving. The push toward the Meuse was alive again. Maybe, just maybe, this miracle meant the offensive had a chance. But as the excitement rippled through his men, another thought crept into Piper's mind, a thought he could not easily dismiss. Why had the Americans abandoned such a fortune? The answer was chilling. They could afford to. What to Germany was life and death, guarded with machine guns and barbed wire, rationed by drops, was to the United States a disposable surplus. The fact that they could leave behind 50,000 gallons without crippling their operations revealed something far more powerful than any tank or gun: America's industrial might. For the moment, though, Piper shoved that realization aside. He watched his men refuel. Tiger and Panther engines coughing back to life, exhaust plumes rising into the cold air. The road to the Meuse, at least for now, was open. But even as those tanks rolled forward once more, the silent truth lingered in the mist. Germany hadn't gained strength that day. They had only revealed the depth of their weakness. As Piper's men refueled in Honsfeld, they celebrated like thirsty travelers stumbling on an oasis in the desert. 50,000 gallons, it seemed like a gift from the gods. But the truth was far more sobering. To the United States, that mountain of gasoline was nothing more than a drop in an ocean. In 1944, American oil wells pumped 1.8 billion barrels of crude. Texas alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. The East Texas oil field, stretching across hundreds of square miles, dwarfed every resource Germany could muster. The figures are almost incomprehensible. While Germany scraped together 33 million barrels of oil that year, barely 2% of America's total, the United States was flooding the world with energy. That imbalance wasn't just about numbers on a chart. It translated into trucks that never stopped rolling, planes that never stopped flying, and ships that crossed oceans faster than Germany could sink them. American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel every single day in late 1944. And they weren't just keeping up, they were stockpiling reserves. By comparison, Piper's entire armored column needed 5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. Hitler had promised them enough to get there, but in reality, they had been given half. From the very start, the operation was a mathematical impossibility. Meanwhile, the Americans weren't improvising. They had built a logistical machine the world had never seen before. There was Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, carrying fuel from England under the English Channel straight into France. At its peak, it delivered 300,000 gallons per day, more than Piper's entire Kampfgruppe would use in the whole offensive. There was the Red Ball Express, a highway of trucks manned by thousands of drivers, many of them African-American soldiers who worked around the clock. They delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily: food, ammunition, and above all, fuel. Convoys stretched for miles, headlights glowing through the night, engines roaring like a heartbeat that kept the Allied armies alive. And while German tanks sat idle for lack of gasoline, American units complained about having too much. Diaries of U.S. officers mention overflowing fuel depots, storage tanks filled to capacity, and deliveries so frequent they didn't know where to put the extra. For Piper, Honsfeld's bounty must have seemed staggering, but in reality, he had stumbled upon a forward depot, a temporary fuel stop for a single infantry division. What the Americans considered a minor supply point, Germany regarded as a treasure capable of altering the fate of a campaign. That contrast tells the real story. When your enemy can abandon more fuel in one small village than your nation can produce in a month, the war is already lost. Piper didn't say it aloud that morning. But as he held the shipping manifests, tracing the journey of American fuel from Texas oil fields to New York docks, across the Atlantic, into Normandy, and all the way to the Belgian frontier in just 6 weeks, the realization must have settled over him like the heavy fog. Germany wasn't just fighting the American army, it was fighting American industry, and that was a battle it could never win. As Piper's men drained jerrycan after jerrycan into the thirsty tanks, a few soldiers wandered into the depot's office. What they found there would deliver a shock even greater than the fuel itself. On a desk lay stacks of shipping manifests. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman, who spoke English from his pre-war job in an import business, picked one up. The neat rows of typed words told a story more devastating than any battlefield loss. The fuel stacked outside hadn't just been hauled from a nearby refinery. It had traveled thousands of miles, Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, over the English Channel to Normandy, and then more than 400 miles by truck to Honsfeld. The entire journey had taken less than 6 weeks. 6 weeks. For Germans who had spent years struggling to move supplies across a continent ravaged by bombing and partisans, this was nothing short of miraculous. Hoffman showed the manifest to Piper himself. The young colonel read it once, then again. His face went pale. He crumpled the paper in his hand, but the truth remained. If the Americans could deliver gasoline from Texas oil fields to the Belgian frontier in 6 weeks, what chance did Germany have? And then came the final blow. Another soldier stumbled across a stack of newspapers, Stars and Stripes, dated December 15th, just 2 days earlier. The front-page headline announced the opening of a brand-new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun. Its capacity, 300,000 gallons per day, 300,000 gallons, every day, from a single pipeline. That figure was more than Piper's entire armored column would use in the whole offensive. In other words, while he was gambling everything on 50,000 gallons found in a Belgian village, the Americans had just turned on a faucet capable of delivering 6 times that amount before breakfast. For the German soldiers, it must have felt like staring at a chasm they could never cross. One veteran later recalled, "We thought we had won the lottery. Then we read those papers. And we realized it wasn't a lottery at all. It was pocket change to the Americans." At that moment, Piper must have understood that Honsfeld wasn't salvation. It was a cruel reminder of Germany's fate. No matter how many depots they seized, no matter how many jerrycans they captured, they were fighting an enemy whose supply lines stretched across oceans and never seemed to run dry. The tanks were fueled. The engines roared back to life. But the spirit of victory, that flicker of hope, was already burning out. For a few fleeting hours after Honsfeld, it seemed as if fate had granted Piper a second chance. Engines rumbled back to life, tracks churned through snow, and his Kampfgruppe pressed forward into the Belgian countryside. But fuel alone could not change the mathematics of failure. The Ardennes was still the Ardennes, narrow roads, steep hills, and villages that became choke points under the weight of German armor. Even with full tanks, Piper's column moved at a crawl. A single disabled Panther could halt dozens of vehicles behind it, forcing frantic repair crews to clear the path. And every wasted hour burned fuel. Then came the resistance. American units, though surprised, fought with a stubborn tenacity that Hitler's planners had not anticipated. Small groups of GIs, often outnumbered 10 to 1, turned crossroads and farmhouses into fortresses. Each skirmish cost Piper precious time, and, more importantly, gasoline. The Tigers and Panthers were monsters of war, but they were also gluttons. A Tiger I consumed nearly 3 gallons of fuel for every mile traveled. By the time Piper reached the village of Stavelot, his tanks had already devoured much of the prize captured at Honsfeld. Vehicles began sputtering to a stop, crews forced to siphon gasoline from one machine just to keep another moving, and the deeper they pushed, the more dangerous it became. American engineers blew bridges as they withdrew, forcing Piper to detour. Each detour meant more fuel, more time, more frustration. At one crossing, desperate German soldiers tried to capture an intact bridge over the Amblève River. They succeeded for a moment, but when Piper's lead tank rumbled onto it, hidden American artillery opened fire. The structure collapsed in flames, taking German hopes with it. Even worse, the skies above, once shrouded in fog, began to clear. With daylight came the roar of Allied fighter bombers, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and Typhoons, circling like hawks. Every time Piper's men moved in daylight, they risked destruction from above. To avoid the planes, they moved at night, crawling forward by moonlight. And again, the idling engines wasted fuel they no longer had to spare. By December 20th, just 3 days after the miracle at Honsfeld, Piper's armored spearhead was sputtering out. Tanks were abandoned by the roadside, some deliberately destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Trucks were left behind, empty, their drivers cursing as they trudged through the snow. The vaunted spear point of the 6th Panzer Army was now a ragged, starving column, stranded in enemy territory. The capture of 50,000 gallons had bought time, but not victory. It was enough to get them deeper into the trap, but not enough to break through. For Joachim Piper, the realization must have been devastating. His orders had been to reach the Meuse River. Instead, he found himself stuck in the Belgian countryside, his tanks running dry, his men exhausted, and the Americans regrouping faster than anyone in Berlin had imagined. The miracle of Honsfeld hadn't changed the war. It had only delayed the inevitable. While Piper's tanks sputtered and died in the forests of Belgium, the American army was drowning in gasoline. For U.S. commanders, fuel wasn't a desperate gamble. It was the lifeblood of their war machine, delivered in quantities so massive that even their own soldiers sometimes joked they didn't know what to do with it all. The contrast was staggering. By the winter of 1944, the United States was consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel every single day in Northwest Europe. And yet, American supply officers worried more about congestion than scarcity. Convoys of trucks, sometimes stretching for 10 miles at a time, rolled night and day, carrying drums of fuel, crates of ammunition, and mountains of rations to the front. This was the Red Ball Express, a logistical miracle that kept Patton's tanks and Bradley's infantry rolling without pause. Most of the drivers were young African-American soldiers who worked around the clock, sleeping in their cabs when they could, braving winter storms and Luftwaffe strafing runs. Without them, the Allied advance after D-Day would have collapsed. With them, the front line never stopped moving forward, and it wasn't just trucks. Beneath the very soil of Europe, the Americans built an invisible network, pipelines that ran from the beaches of Normandy deep into France and Belgium. The most audacious of them all was Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, a system that carried fuel directly from England under the English Channel. At its peak, Pluto pumped 300,000 gallons per day. To grasp that number, in the same moment Piper was rationing his last drops, a single Allied pipeline was delivering 6 times the fuel he had captured at Honsfeld. Every day. American troops often joked about it. Infantrymen laughed that their tanks drank more than we did. Engineers quipped that fuel seemed to fall from the sky. In a sense, it did. Allied cargo planes delivered drums of gasoline to forward airstrips so quickly that some were still warm from the Texas sun when they reached French soil. Meanwhile, back in Germany, civilians were queuing for hours to buy a single liter of kerosene. Farmers hitched their plows to horses. The once feared Wehrmacht was reduced to moving supply wagons with oxen. For Piper and his men, the lesson of Honsfeld had been brutal. What they treated as a miracle was, for the Americans, a casual surplus. The war in the Ardennes wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a collision between two economic realities, one nation running dry, the other awash in resources. And in modern war, oil was more decisive than courage, more powerful than tactics, more critical than even the finest tanks or guns. In that sense, Piper wasn't just fighting the U.S. Army. He was fighting American oil wells, American pipelines, American factories, and an industrial ocean that Germany could never hope to cross. For a brief moment at Honsfeld, spirits had soared. Men who had cursed their empty tanks the night before now slapped each other on the back, laughing as they poured American gasoline into their Panthers and Tigers. They believed fate had chosen them for victory. The road to Antwerp seemed possible again. But within days, that fragile hope collapsed. As the column crawled deeper into Belgium, the fuel from Honsfeld bled away mile by mile. Engines that had roared to life sputtered again. Tank crews, once jubilant, grew silent as their fuel gauges drifted toward empty. Soldiers began to whisper what no one dared to say aloud. "We are going to run out again." The signs of despair were everywhere. By December 20th, tanks and trucks littered the roadsides, abandoned where they had died. Some were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. Others were simply left behind, hulks of frozen steel in the snow. Piper's vaunted spearhead, once the pride of Hitler's gamble, was turning into a scrapyard. The men themselves felt the weight. Infantry marched for miles through knee-deep snow, exhausted and hungry, often passing by tanks that once carried them. The contrast was bitter. Machines worth millions of Reichsmarks, useless without a few gallons of fuel. Morale cracked. Letters recovered from Piper's troops after the war told the same story. Disappointment, bitterness, even betrayal. One SS officer wrote, "We were lions sent into battle, but our claws had been cut off. Every road led us to the same fate, the empty fuel can." Piper himself must have felt the irony. At Honsfeld, he had tasted triumph, yet, in truth, the discovery had only prolonged the agony. Instead of collapsing early, his Kampfgruppe had been dragged further into the Ardennes, deeper into the trap. And then came the final blow. The skies cleared. American and British fighter bombers descended like hawks. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed the roads, blasting trucks and fuel wagons. Pilots reported columns of black smoke rising for miles, the smell of burning gasoline filling the air. Every can of fuel became a target. Every tank that managed to move risked fiery destruction from above. The men understood what Piper himself surely realized. 50,000 gallons meant nothing when your enemy could replace it before lunch. Hope had turned to despair. The prize of Honsfeld, once hailed as a miracle, now felt like a cruel joke. By December 23rd, Piper's column was cornered near La Glaise. Tanks stood abandoned in barns, hidden under snow, or lined up in rows, waiting for demolition charges. The men who had once dreamed of Antwerp now fought simply to survive, burning their last drops of fuel in desperate rearguard actions. The miracle of Honsfeld had not saved them. It had only postponed the inevitable long enough for them to realize the war was already lost. By the winter of 1944, it was no longer a secret to anyone paying attention. World War II was a war of oil. Guns, tanks, planes, ships, they all depended on it. And in that equation, Germany never stood a chance. The story of Joachim Peiper at Honsfeld was only a microcosm of a larger truth. His men had captured 50,000 gallons of gasoline, and for a brief moment believed it might alter the course of the Ardennes offensive. But in the grand scheme of things, that fuel was nothing. A single American refinery could produce that much in less than an hour. Modern war wasn't won by courage or clever tactics alone. It was won by industrial power, by who could keep the engines running longest. Consider the numbers. In 1944, the United States produced 60% of the world's oil. American factories turned that oil into aviation fuel, diesel, and gasoline at a pace no other nation could match. Tankers carried it across oceans faster than U-boats could sink them. Pipelines pumped it straight to the front. Supply trucks delivered it by the ton day and night in a ceaseless flow. Germany, by contrast, was bleeding out. Synthetic fuel plants bombed to rubble. Romanian oil fields lost to the Red Army. Rail lines shattered by Allied air power. Every drop of gasoline that reached the front was a miracle, and yet never enough. By late 1944, even the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, could barely fly. A fighter pilot sat idle, waiting for fuel that never came. Historians often say the Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble. That's true, but it was also his last delusion, that somehow, through sheer willpower and surprise, Germany could overcome an enemy swimming in resources. Peiper's 50,000 gallons were a symbol of that delusion. He thought it meant survival. Instead, it revealed the stark reality. Germany was fighting a nation that could waste more fuel in a week than the Reich could produce in a year. And so, in the snowy forests of Belgium, the lesson of modern war was written in fire and steel. Oil was the real weapon, pipelines and refineries, just as decisive as tanks and bombers. Whoever controlled the flow of fuel controlled the fate of armies. For the United States, that meant victory. For Germany, it meant doom. In late December 1944, Joachim Peiper stood among the ruins of his command. His Kampfgruppe, once the tip of Hitler's spear, had been reduced to a shattered column of burned-out tanks and exhausted men. Near the Belgian village of La Glaise, surrounded and cut off, he gave the order no German commander ever wanted to give. Abandon the vehicles. The mighty Tigers and Panthers, once symbols of Nazi power, were blown apart by their own crews. Flames lit up the night sky as Peiper's men slipped away on foot, trudging through snow and darkness, leaving behind the machines that had defined their strength. For Peiper, the meaning was clear. All the courage of his men, all the ferocity of their fight, all the gallons of fuel captured at Honsfeld, it hadn't been enough. It never could have been. That single American depot with its 50,000 gallons had seemed like salvation. In truth, it had been a cruel reminder of the impossible odds. For the Americans, it was a minor stockpile, one of hundreds scattered across Europe. For the Germans, it was treasure. That contrast alone told the story. Germany was finished. The realization must have struck Peiper like a blow. He had witnessed it with his own eyes. America's strength was not just in its soldiers or its tanks or even its generals. It was in its oil fields, its factories, its endless trains and pipelines and convoys. Victory was not forged in the forests of the Ardennes. It had been decided long before in the oil fields of Texas, the assembly lines of Detroit, and the shipyards of Richmond. Germany had gambled everything on capturing American fuel, and in doing so, it revealed the truth. The Reich wasn't just losing battles, it had already lost the war. As Peiper led his weary men eastward, leaving behind the smoking wrecks, he carried that knowledge with him. The last offensive of Nazi Germany had collapsed, and with it, the illusion that the Reich could defy the weight of American industry. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for weeks more, costing tens of thousands of lives. But the outcome was sealed. Germany's fate had been written not on the battlefield, but in the balance sheets of oil production and industrial output. And so, in the end, Piper's captured fuel depot was not a miracle. It was a tombstone. A marker of the moment when even the most loyal of Hitler's commanders understood Germany was doomed. If you've stayed with us through this story, you've seen how the war was not only fought with bullets and bravery, but with barrels of oil and industrial might. The tale of Joachim Piper at Honsfeld is a reminder that wars are won not only by soldiers at the front, but by the factories, workers, and resources that keep them moving. If you'd like to hear more untold stories of World War II, about the battles, the machines, and the people who shaped history, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next journey into the past.